Are you looking to stay ahead of the curve in the latest trends in enterprise tech? Look no further than the Breaking Analysis podcast with Dave Vellante. This data-driven program dives into the most important topics facing the enterprise tech industry today. With a data-first approach that leverages ETR's renowned surveys of IT decision-makers and insight from the CUBE community, Breaking Analysis delivers in-depth research on the most important topics facing technologists and IT buyers. Whether you're a business leader, an IT professional, investor, or just an avid follower of the industry, this podcast is a must-listen. Just search Breaking Analysis Podcast wherever you get your podcast and tune in today to stay ahead of the game in enterprise tech.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. April's upon us, and it is springtime. It is Easter for those of you listening on Sunday. Apologize for getting this show out a little bit late. We had some technical difficulties, had some bad weather that rolled through the southeast part of the United States over the weekend, and had a little bit of difficulty getting it out the door. But hope everybody's doing well. Another Sunday Perspective show. And as I've mentioned a lot of times on the show, I'm always looking for a couple of through lines to try and create something interesting for the Sunday Perspective if we're not doing something of a historical nature. And this week I had written some things down, and I was a little unsure of exactly where it was going to go, and I'd taken some notes, and then got a really good feedback email note from a listener about last week's show, which was really about kind of open and free and those sort of things. And the listener has said, look, appreciate the show. Thanks for putting it out there. This last week's show about open and, whether you should pay for things and so forth, got a little preachy. And I got to say, I completely agree with them. I did get a little bit preachy, and I didn't mean to be sort of old man yells at the cloud. I actually, one of the things that I think I maybe over-rotated a little bit on the Sunday Perspective show is, doing this thing where it's like, hey, me having seen some of these things before, having been around the block in tech for a few years, as they say, maybe I've skewed some of these Sunday Perspective show towards, hey, folks that are newer to the industry, here's some things to watch out for. You've probably never seen this. And you know what? I completely agree with that. I've gotten a little bit to where that becomes an easy thing to sort of fall back on. I do think it is worthwhile sometimes for us to reset ourselves, if we haven't seen something in a long time. But at the same time, last week's show was a little bit preachy, so apologize for that. But as I was thinking about the kind of the topic I had written down for this week, which is really going to be about kind of this, what feels like kind of a Cambrian explosion of AI. Everything all day is just, commentary and experiments and demos and various things about, different types of AI, generative AI and, chat GPT and things that are being wrapped around all these different things. And, I feel like to a certain extent, the Sunday Perspective show has been, for the most part, me trying to give a certain amount of advice or some perspective from sort of a known angle that I could kind of pass along to the audience, pass along to the community. And for the first time in a long time, reading through some of these things, and maybe it's just the overwhelming nature of how much is out there. Maybe it's just the fact that, Twitter now has this stupid feature where you can turn a tweet into a blog, and everybody has now figured out, I don't know if that's just gaming the algorithm or not, but I feel like every tweet is a thread, and it starts off with 1,000 words, and then it turns into this, here's my list of 15 things. It feels like the old thing that were just listicle articles. I forget which terrible news outlet used to do nothing but listicles. But I feel like Twitter has become that. And the AI community, or the community of people, whether they're DevRel people or, who's doing it, feels a little overwhelming. And I don't mean that in the sense of I don't want to read lists, but it's a little overwhelming in the sense of, it feels like overnight, literally overnight, that you're like, boy, there is so many things going on, and you're not exactly sure where to focus on. It's a little bit like just walking into, I'll use an example. I was on a little bit of a trip this weekend, went through a Buc-ee's. And for those of you in the United States, you'll know what Buc-ee's is. Well, you might know what Buc-ee's is if you're in a certain part of the country. But just the experience of it, walking in for the first time with the noise and all the different things going on, a little bit overwhelming. I feel like that's a little bit of what's going on with sort of the AI discussion these days. And the reason I bring that up and sort of circle it around with the mea culpa about last week's show and sort of being preachy on it is, This week's show is going to be very anti-preachy. This show is going to be very me trying to figure some stuff out. And hopefully if I can figure some stuff out, or maybe more importantly, get the community to help me figure out some stuff. We're going to talk a little bit about, what it feels like right now to be completely overwhelmed with some of these things, with so much going on with AI, just what feels like completely coming out of nowhere. So I want to kind of jump into that after the break. Upland Software provides modern, secure fax solutions for businesses of all sizes. It drives content for intelligent processing and digital transformation worldwide, helping solve real business problems by providing enterprise software for getting things done. Upland offers cloud, hybrid, and on-premise fax solutions that integrate fax transmissions into business processes, utilizing machine learning technology to process and extract content. Didn't know that fax was still a thing? Have they got news for you? The demand for secure, user-friendly fax has skyrocketed for industries such as healthcare and financial services because users need trusted technology that safeguards sensitive information while supporting digital document workflows. Upland is ready to show you fax in action. Cloudcast listeners can try 1 month of Upland Cloud Fax for free and enter to win a wireless Bluetooth speaker by visiting info.uplandsoftware.com/cloudcast. That's info.uplandsoftware.com/cloudcast. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to dive a little bit into this, just what feels like an explosion of new AI stuff all of a sudden. And I want to put it in some context, as we always try and do with these Sunday perspectives, not just sort of read through the news headlines and other types of things like that. We've mentioned before, I think we've mentioned before on the show, I feel like it's a conversation that happens quite a bit, but we have a tendency in our industry to watch trends happen, and things go on and things grow, and we're excited when things grow, and sometimes we're bummed out when things kind of fall apart or don't keep growing up into the right, sort of the normal hockey stick type of thing. But sometimes we have situations in which things feel like there's a little bit of a lull, or sometimes you feel like, boy, we've done all the technology, like nothing else is going to come after this. We've sort of reached saturation. And to a certain extent, what we find is sometimes when those things happen, when it feels like there's either a lull or things aren't moving anywhere or something failed or whatever it might be, there's a certain kind of morose that happens over the industry. But because of the nature of our industry, because of the curiosity of people, because of how much money is involved with it, because of what's potential, what's possible with computing and all sorts of stuff, we tend to have these explosions, these sort of new paradigms happen that come out of a lull, a dip, a failure, if you will. And just to give some context of it, like the SaaS industry, in essence, came out of the first failure of the internet bubble. Everybody was building their own things. They're building their own hardware and software. There's this sort of story of the four horsemen of the internet, which was, at the time Sun and EMC and Cisco, and I believe Intel was compute. I forget what all they were. Anyways, it was like Oracle. It was like Oracle, Cisco, Sun, and like EMC, I think from a storage perspective. Anyways, it was everybody was buying their own equipment and building their own data centers and all that stuff. And then SaaS sort of came out of the first internet bubble. And then, out of the sort of second, the housing bubble and sort of the economy collapsing and so on and so forth, maybe not directly, but timing wise was sort of directly after cloud came out of that. And cloud sort of emerged, and AWS emerged really around the same time as the iPhone, and the explosion of like, hey, I want, apps that, can now scale to millions and millions of users and millions of devices. And the thing that's weird about this AI stuff is AI isn't new. AI has been, a technology that's been explored and experimented and researched and improved and so forth since the 60s, right? People will talk about AI winter and, sort of the evolution of things and, all these sort of stories of people saying, hey, the giant brain of the internet and Skynet and things are going to take over when AI takes over. And we've seen ebbs and flows of it, right? We went back a decade or so plus. I think Harvard Business Journal, one of those sort of highfalutin magazines, wrote an article that basically was like, "Hey, data scientist is the new sexiest job in the world." Which, again, computer science and sexiness never went together, but it sort of kicked off this fascination with, hey, we've now put a name and a face with AI, and this is going to transform every business. And to a certain extent, data analyst, data scientist has become a very important job, but it never really percolated. It never really had its iPhone moment where it was everybody has access to this stuff. And so AI is not new, but it did feel like there was a certain kind of lag, to a certain extent, maybe like a depression that was happening in the tech industry because of what had happened with COVID. Everybody was home. Yes, there was a sort of a pseudo boom with like Web3 and crypto. There was an excitement of like, ooh, maybe this is the next thing, or maybe this metaverse stuff and AR and VR is the next thing. And those things still, maybe they will. Who knows? They haven't really broken through. They haven't really proven themselves as being worthy of all the hype, and to a certain extent, they've turned out to be massive frauds. But this new AI thing seems like it has legs. And what's interesting is it doesn't seem to have sort of gradual legs. It seems to be like, like cicadas every 17 years. It's just come out of the woodwork all of a sudden. It's loud. It's all, it's in your face, and it's very accessible. And I think you put all those sort of things together. You put together, sort of new, what feels new, because there's now a user interface to AI. There's now accessibility to AI. There's, various ways that people can get to it. There's chaos. There's uncertainty. There's wild, wild predictions. Everything from, thousands of people signing these letters that are now saying, please stop. Please have a pause on AI research. Don't let this thing get out of control. The end of mankind. Who knows? Maybe. I don't know. To people writing all sorts of articles about the hundreds of millions of people that will be out of jobs here within the next couple of years. So on one end, there's a very distinct paranoia that exists now that it feels like AI has been made available to the masses. And at the same time, there is, sort of newfound excitement, right? You're seeing articles being written after COVID hit and everybody, quote unquote, moved out of San Francisco. San Francisco's dead. Miami's the new San Francisco. Everywhere else is the new Silicon Valley. To now there are articles that are being written that, San Francisco is back and Silicon Valley is now Cerebral Valley, and just, sort of a little bit of craziness. And at the same time, you're trying to figure out like, okay, but this technology seems pretty interesting. So like, which one is it? And I think the reality is, and this is where my sort of lack of perspective is going to sort of show through on this, is trying to figure out like, how do you create a framework in your head for figuring out how much of this is real, how much of this will impact you, how much of this will be good for you, how much of this is a learning curve, all those things. And so what I kind of want to do in this show is, instead of me kind of giving something back to the community, is sort of asking for the community, like, hey, how are you all looking at this stuff? And again, this may be where the diversity of the community, of age, of experience may be different. And I'd love to hear from people that are new to this stuff, that are that this might be your first experience at a big boom in technology, versus maybe some of the folks that are more experienced, and you're sort of looking at this and going, oh, I'm skeptical about it. But I'm curious what your framework is going to be for figuring out how to try and get your arms around it, right? At the end of the day, it's a tool, it's a technology. But at the same time, it potentially has big impacts to culture, has big impacts to, to your day-to-day job potentially. And I thought what I would do is give a few thoughts. So I put a bunch of links in the show notes, and these are kind of indicative of the kind of stuff that I'm seeing as somewhat interesting out on the web. And again, by no means is this fully inclusive. It's just sort of a smattering. It's really just a scratching of the surface. But, lists of the best tools to be digging into, or, examples of, things that have been built fairly easily, right? So think of this as like the low code, no code of AI, if you will. But as I was thinking about this, and I'm trying to wrap my head around this, because again, this is by no means going to be something that people are going to harness overnight. I think, and this is where I'm kind of looking for feedback, is there's lots of ways to learn, right? There's lots of ways to dive in, right? There's going to be people who want to learn the basics, and Aaron and I will do the best we can to find some great guests to help us with the basics of what do these things mean. We've had Sam Charrington on a number of times. Sam sort of tends to give us trends. We always highly recommend his show, This Week in AI and ML. For some of you, Sam's show might be too in-depth, right? So we're going to do our best to try and be part of the conversation, but again, realize that we're trying to learn some of these things as much as be experts at it. We know there's going to be some people who just dive in and want to experiment with the technology, build some applications, right? We see all sorts of examples of people going like, hey, here's what, and this is one of these things where right now the terminology doesn't just jump off my tongue. And so I'm going to kind of butcher what some of but the stuff in which you can just basically say like, hey, create me an image of Deadpool, playing poker on the hood of the brand new Mercedes or something like that. And, here's how I refine it. I want it with this lighting, and I want it set in the scene of, Batman movie or whatever. Like people will be doing that. You see those things and you go, oh, that's really cool. And then the second thing that you start to get into is you start to figure out like, okay, some of those things are very cool, and people will build examples of, hey, I talked to ChatGPT and I asked it to do a bunch of things, and then I went and kind of fact check it, and it got certain things right and it got certain things wrong. And so that in and of itself is a learning process, right? Like how helpful will this thing be for me? Like how much am I expecting it to be essentially like cheating on my homework, and how much of it is really like, oh, it's more like a tutor that pushes me in a direction, but I'm still having to do the homework because I'm still having to figure out, is it accurate, right? Like, is it correct? And we've seen some cool things. We've seen it, writing code, and we've seen people experiment with stuff. And so there's been examples of those things, and those are all kind of interesting. So I think for me, step one is what's going to be a framework for trying to learn this stuff. Again, I'm curious what other people are doing to sort of think about it, right? Do you think about it in terms of technology? Do you think about it in terms of practicality? Do you think of it just in terms of, the scope of what you do at your day job or your side hustle or, whatever, maybe you're trying to make things better for, I don't know, whatever you're doing, coaching your kids' soccer team, whatever. And then I think the second thing is you have to start thinking about, and again, these are all various priorities. Like in our case, we try and both understand the technology, but we always try and understand the market as well. And so one of the things that we're going to really try and be understanding is like kind of following the money. And I think what tends to happen is we have a tendency to go after the biggest things first, the biggest names first, because it's easiest to point to, hey, that's probably where the money's going to go, right? So you're going to see a lot of shows and hear a lot of shows about OpenAI, that company, whether it's their partnership with Microsoft or how much it costs to run a query or, what they potentially can do to, impact various economics. And that's going to be a really interesting aspect of it. And for some people who aren't digging into, using the technology, understanding the economics of it are going to be very, very relevant. And so would love to kind of get some feedback from people about, how are you thinking about that, right? Like, are you thinking about it in terms of what does this mean to do computing, processing and power? Like, how much is it actually going to cost to be able to generate enough interesting stuff to potentially displace a manual task in your world? And I don't mean that in like, hey, let's go, try and replace a lot of people, but there will be people who look at this in terms of how much does this cost to, get 60% as good as something we do manually or repetitively, or something that we wish we didn't have to hire somebody for because it's kind of brain dead sort of work that, if we could figure out a way to do this. Like, I'm very interested in that. I'm interested in the people that are figuring out, looking at where VC money is going to go. We're always interested in that. So I think we will be looking very much at sort of then, the basics from a technology perspective, that we can help communicate the basis of the economics, sort of the companies and the players, how much of it will be VC funded, how much of it will be things that spin out of the companies that today already have the biggest data sets. So whether this is Google or Amazon or OpenAI or, whoever else. I think the third thing that's going to be really interesting is figuring out the kind of the user interaction and the ecosystem interaction. And by that, I mean, if we use sort of what's out there, for example, we know OpenAI just announced something that they talk about plugins, sort of the plugin ecosystem. So, how will third parties to these big giant sources of data or the services that provide these, like how will they be able to play in this? And why that's really important is that starts to get into helping you understand the size of the ecosystem, the size of the flexibility in which you can participate. That's also going to give you a sense of like, how many copycats are we going to see of the same thing, right? So for example, one of the conversations that's been going on a lot is people saying, hey, if you're a VC, be very, very careful about investing in a company who just says, hey, we built a wrapper around the OpenAI API, and we do this unique thing. And why that's interesting is that you're going to have, a lot of people who do that, sort of computer science 101, hackathon 101 sort of stuff, and maybe something cool that kind of goes viral, but maybe isn't terribly sustainable because, if all you're doing is building a wrapper around, something that OpenAI could look at their ecosystem and go, hey, we're going to eat our ecosystem, like that's potentially problematic. The other thing becomes, things like, well, if you have certain unique domain experience and that unique domain experience maybe is most valuable in real time, right? Keeping in mind these models aren't always kept up to date. Maybe they're a year behind or whatever it might be, or it's just the stuff we do is really unique and we're now able to take advantage of what AI can do that we couldn't do. That becomes a really interesting differentiation, right? So, you think about a lot of times, like, why in the world would somebody want to start a company that's just about this thing? This seems like a weird little niche. And then you realize, like, oh, no, that weird little niche is required by hundreds and hundreds of thousands of companies. And, if you were really good at it and you can simplify it and so forth, like now you become the next Salesforce or whatever it might be. So that to me would be kind of the third thing to be really interesting is of the sort of, whether they're open source projects or the big 900-pound gorilla companies, what do they open up? What builds around their ecosystem? What's possible? What's not possible? And then, I think, the last thing is, I think there's going to be a certain extent of this that is going to be really important, and it's going to be kind of a personal thing for each person is to figure out, like, how much should you care? How much of this should matter to you? Some people will look at this as like, oh, this is going to be great for my job because it's going to save me a bunch of time. We don't have the budget to hire a bunch of people, but we can do certain things. That'll be awesome. Other people will feel overwhelmed because maybe they don't feel comfortable with things that are new, and that's normal in any technology trend shift, right? So the sort of fear of like, I don't really know what's going on, imposter syndrome, all that kind of stuff. And the other thing is, like, you're going to read a lot because, again, we are coming out of a sort of a very low period in time with the pandemic, with people working at home, with people looking for new things all the time, the economy being a little tighter than it's been in the past, and people looking for new ways to do stuff. And you're going to hear a lot of hype, and you're going to hear a lot of misinformation, and you're going to hear a lot of bravado and other stuff, and it's going to be trying to figure out, how do I recalibrate my sense of noise, signal versus noise, as the folks over at theCUBE like to say. So I think that's going to be sort of the fourth thing to kind of wrap your head around. So, understand the technology, be able to follow the money as it's relevant to you, be able to understand the ecosystem and the opportunities around the ecosystem of things that you don't necessarily have to build, but you can bring interesting expertise to or bring value to. And then finally figure out a framework for yourself to say, hey, how am I gonna put myself into this world? Do I need to put myself into this world? Does it need to be relevant to me? Am I going to get far behind? Am I afraid of change? How do I cope with that sort of stuff and sort of deal with it? But that's, to me, as I think about going into this new thing, having done some new stuff in the past, it feels like a workable framework. Now, what I don't have in my mind, and then I would love to hear anecdotes and feedback from people in our community, and I know you guys are great about doing that, is how are you thinking about it? What are some things that you've found so far that have been useful? What are some things that you found that have been time sinks and time wastes and and useless, or kind of scams or frauds or whatever? So would love to hear that. If people have things they can pass along that they're willing to also share with the community, let us know. This is probably where us having a newsletter or Slack or something would have been really nice to have. Maybe this is something that kicks our butt and tells us we need to get that going. But yeah, if you have ideas, please feel free to share them with us. If you're willing to share them with the community, please let us know. Definitely want to make sure that you get credit and visibility for those things. And I think one of the things we're going to start trying to do is, not that this becomes an AI podcast. We can never keep up with the stuff that Sam and many, many others do. But I think we are going to try and at least put one thing in the show notes and Cloud News of the Week every week that's relevant to this, that we think can be adoptable by people, that it'll be relevant to a lot of people. And just, it'll force us to keep up with what's going on as well. So anyways, with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Again, no preaching this week, more, asking questions, being in an area of newness, of uncertainty. And that's a kind of a good place to be, right? It makes your brain think in different ways than you do when things are down or slow or whatever. So anyways, with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Everybody's doing well. If you're listening to this on Sunday, happy Easter to those of you that celebrate around the world. Interesting time of the year. Spring is out. Everything's blooming. It's kind of good. Makes you feel good. The sun's out. Kind of get re-energized and so forth. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Thanks everybody for listening. Another Sunday Perspective show. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for helping us grow the community. And we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.